Let's talk about Karl Nell. See him popping up in UFO stories lately, but his name in association with claims of non-human intelligence, UFO crash retrievals, government cover-ups, etc., non-human biologics, these go back almost a year. And although it's nice to see someone of his stature making these claims, making these statements at a somewhat big public speaking event, that there's 100% zero doubt that non-human intelligence exists and is interacting with human beings. I mean, it's cool, it's good, but it's also interesting that he did say the exact same thing almost a year ago. So Karl Nell, who is he? Let's start there. Let's get a little bit of an understanding of who Karl Nell is. And before this, actually, he spoke, I happened to be doing some deeper research into him because he's always been this kind of interesting, highly experienced and credentialed individual who is the only one who put his name down in the original article, uh, as well as Chris Mellon, in the original article where David Grusch's story broke in the debrief. So this is Karl Nell. And here's a little bio of what I had put together about him. He does have a very interesting background. Distinguished military officer, had a lot of leadership roles in the armed forces, where his specialty appears to have been in strategic planning, operational management. And it's kind of interesting to know that that's his background, because if you watched his presentation at the Seoul conference about disclosure, about UFO UAP disclosure, his whole thing is that he thinks we should have a very structured plan and thoughtful approach and strategic approach to disclosure. Here's some of the positions he had, all right, which are pretty interesting. Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Northrop Grumman for 13 years, from 1998 to 2011. Now, if you've been following the UFO subject, you know that again and again, people who claim to have inside knowledge have alleged that Northrop Grumman is one of the big aerospace companies that has been involved in recovered UFOs and reverse engineering for a long time. So it's interesting to note that he was there. And here's another position he was in that would have given him potentially some access to some top secret truths and realities about an alien presence or UFOs or whatever you want to call it. He was a commander in the U.S. Space Command from 1990 to 1994. And then on top of that, he had high positions within the corporations of Bell Laboratories, which you don't hear about Bell Laboratories as much, but actually Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, in his 1997 book, The Day After Roswell, where he said that when he was working as the head of the Pentagon's Foreign Technology Desk, he was given some files of kind of pieces of debris that had been recovered from the Roswell crash that nobody ever really did anything with. And he said in the book that he gave some of this material to Bell Laboratories, and that was involved in some of their technological breakthroughs. And then, of course, probably the most highest kind of frequency of being alleged to be involved in advancing UFO propulsion technologies and craft is Lockheed Martin. So he also worked at Lockheed Martin. And who knows what he was exposed to at both of these places. And then lastly, the Defense Intelligence Agency, okay, which is basically if you don't know, it's basically the Department of Defense, the Pentagon's CIA. It's pretty much the same type of agency. So, we could see that he certainly was inside some circles, for sure, for sure. And most recently, he has been serving. There's some. There's a little bit. It's a little bit unclear if he's still doing this. His LinkedIn profile seems to say that he still is, but we'd have to dig a little deeper. But he was, or still is, the modernization advisor to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. So still involved, obviously, in the armed forces at a high level. And here's where his involvement appears to have come into the UFO and the UAP transparency movement, is that Karl Nell served as the U.S. Army's liaison to the UAP task force from 2021 to 2022. And that's when he worked with David Grusch, who he, in the debrief article, which we'll take a quick look at in a moment, from last year, July 2023, that's where he went on the record saying that David Grusch is, quote, beyond reproach. So there's our background of Karl Nell for the most part. And perhaps it's interesting also to note that he was the U.S. Army's liaison to the UAP task force. Now, you hear a lot about the Air Force, you hear about the CIA, you even hear about the FBI, you hear about the Marines, you hear about the Navy, but you don't hear as much about the Army, especially in the modern era now of the UFO subject. And it's interesting to think about what might be there. For example, Colonel Corso, to reference him again, when he was working at the head of the technology desk at the Pentagon, and before that, he was actually a military advisor to President Eisenhower. But Lieutenant Colonel Corso, he was an Army guy, and these files of the Roswell different debris belong to the Army. So you haven't really seen anyone from the Army coming through. It's a lot of Air Force and other Navy and other areas. So it's kind of interesting. And of course, we know it seems like there is a decently strong case for the fact that the U.S. Army had something called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, IPU, which was apparently involved in crash retrievals back in the day, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. So who knows what he might know about that. And here's a little bit more about his credibility. In 2022, in his performance evaluation, Nell was described by Laura Potter, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence at the Department of the Army. She wrote in his report, in his review, that, quote, he is an officer with the strongest possible moral compass. Okay, so this is who Karl Nell is. And of course, yeah, he continues to speak about, a plan for UFO, UAP disclosure. And he's certainly a very strong person to have in this push for disclosure. Here's a quote, and this is from the debrief article. So just to show you that real quick, this was the article that dropped on June 5th, 2023, the same day that David Grusch's News Nation interview dropped. And of course, you can go read this, and I guess the search feature is not working. There it is. Here's Karl Nell in the article calling David Grusch beyond reproach, and where he also gives us this other quote where he's saying the same thing that he said at the SALT conference that is in recent news the last couple of days. And here's the quote from the article. He said, David Grusch's assertion concerning the existence of reverse engineering technologies of unknown origin is fundamentally correct, as is the indisputable realization that at least some of these technologies of unknown origin derive from non-human intelligence. June 5th, 2023. So yes, Karl said this a year ago. The same thing, in other words. Now what he said was that there's zero doubt, and indisputable means the same thing. So yes, good for him. Good for him, and it's great to see someone with such high credibility coming out and saying this. But let's go a little bit further into what he said. All right. Now, remember, as we touched on in the last video, David Grusch was supposed to speak at this SALT conference. And again, you can go Google that. It's a kind of a tech corporate, high level, sort of exclusive panel conference type of event that they have every year. And they have some fairly big names come there. And they had Gary Nolan there in the past. And that's when Gary Nolan made that. And he's the scientist from Stanford who's one of the few, outspoken scientists that's confirming that, non-human intelligence, aka aliens and UFOs and all that, are legitimate. So Gary Nolan said when they asked him pretty much the same question, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, and he said, they said, what is your evaluation of the possibility that is non-human intelligence in our world, or something to that nature? And I'm trying to just pull up a picture of that here while I summarize it, of course, and you can listen to him say this. But Gary, and that's when Gary Nolan famously said it 100%. The guy asked him, what's the percentage you would give that aliens are here and that UFOs are real and all that, and he said 100%, right? That they visited Earth and there's sort of an ongoing presence. So this is a little bit of the background of the whole SALT thing, if you haven't been up to speed on that. And David Grusch canceled sort of pretty much last minute, and then Karl Nell came to replace him. And people have been reporting on what he said there, of course. So, of course, the big headliner quote, once again, we've said it a couple times here, he said that zero doubt that non-human intelligence exists and has been interacting with humanity, which he said for a long time. And that is something that is pretty interesting, actually. I am actually currently taking an online course that is actually the lectures being done by Richard Dolan. And he was talking about, I thought he brought up a pretty good point, in that in a lot of ways in the UFO field, a lot of people will just kind of take it as a given when we bring up the question of how long have the non-human intelligence, aliens, extraterrestrials, whatever you want to call them, how long have they been interacting with humanity on Earth? And a lot of people will just say, oh, for a long time, ancient times. And I think Richard Dolan actually, he kind of goes against the grain a little bit, but makes a good point, saying that, hold on, like, we should really think about, like, what's the evidence? Maybe that's true, but maybe it's not as much of a given as we think, and maybe we need to look more closely at that. But Karl Nell is saying that, and like I was just mentioning the Gary Nolan saying 100% a year or two earlier, it does seem like a little bit of a coincidence. They ask the same question, and instead of Karl Nell saying it's 100%, he says there's zero doubt. So I don't know. Is that just how it played out? Was Karl Nell kind of rehearsed on that a little bit, thinking about how his comments would be put down in comparison to, Gary Nolan and the few people that have spoken at these public events? I don't know, but it kind of sticks out to me. Now, let's get into this last part here about what one of his responses was. Okay, and this is, to me, where it gets pretty interesting. The host asked him, he said, wow, all right, so you're so confident, zero doubt. And he says, what at what point did you see evidence? What can you tell us about the evidence or whatever it was that made you become so confident to be 100%? And Karl Nell, you would expect that maybe, like some of these other people have done, they say, well, I can't really speak about the specific details, like Grusch has in interviews, but they'll give us something, like, I was shown certain documents that convinced me that this was undeniable. He could have said something like that, right? But if you watch it, he answers it immediately. It's almost like maybe he already knew where he was going to go with it, but he does really dodge around it, and he doesn't answer the question really. And what his response is he says, there are certain high level people that have made certain claims and made certain distinctions, and he brings up Haim Eshed and Paul Hellyer. I think he brings up Paul Hellyer first, and then he brings up Haim Eshed, right? And if you don't know who Paul Hellyer and Haim Eshed are, you definitely go dig deeper into them. We could take a moment right here, actually, to briefly go over them without taking up too much time here, because I do have them here on my book project. And this is Paul Hellyer, and yes, he was a Canadian engineer and politician, and notably served as Canada's Minister of National Defense in the 1960s. And then from about 2005 until he passed away in 2021, he was outspoken and publicly advocated for the increased transparency of UFO and UAP. And he was saying that, extraterrestrials have been engaged with human beings, like literally, that there's agreements, and that, his source, if you watch his interviews, which really is where I get all these quotes from, is that a high-ranking general that was beyond reproach for him told him that there's been face-to-face meetings between U.S. officials and extraterrestrials from other star systems. So that's where Paul Hellyer is getting his information from, and we can assume from other sources as well. And I get it, that is pretty compelling. And Haim Eshed is perhaps even more compelling, because even though Paul Hellyer was the equivalent of our Secretary of Defense of Canada for a number of years, Brigadier General Haim Eshed in Israel, he was the Israeli space chief, the director of their space and military space security program for almost 30 years. He was responsible for launching 20 satellites. He's widely cited as the father of Israel's space program. And there's more and more. He was involved in the National Council for Research and Development, member of the steering committee of the Israeli Space Agency. In 1967, he was awarded the Chief of Staff Citation, which is the highest non-combat decoration awarded by the IDF. He also received the Israel Defense Prize, which is the highest civilian defense honor of the state of Israel, 3 times. And interestingly, the reasons for receiving this were classified, which is interesting. And other details, he served as in the highly secretive Unit 81, working with the IDF's Military Intelligence Directorate. Okay, and then of course, what's so intriguing about him is that he came out in 2020, not that long ago, and he wrote a book. He partnered up with a journalist, and he wrote a book. And the journalist interviewed him about the book. And a couple of media outlets interviewed the journalist and grabbed some of the quotes that the journalist shared. And that's when the Haim Eshed story broke in the West. Okay. But since making those claims in 2020, you haven't heard a peep from him. And he's 91 years old now, and apparently he's still working as a professor of aeronautics and astronautics at various space technology institutions. So Karl Nell is citing Haim Eshed. Now, why is this important? Hopefully this video, we've seen how highly credentialed Karl Nell is. Okay. And when Karl Nell is being asked in his besides the Seoul conference, which was kind of like a closed event, I guess the SALT conferences too, but Karl Nell was giving a presentation at the Seoul conference. At the SALT conference, he's doing an interview. So he's sort of on the spot. And when he's asked, what convinced you beyond any doubt? And he cites Haim Eshed. That's very interesting. Because what Haim Eshed is saying is taking it to a whole nother level. Okay. Yeah, like it's way more than there's reverse engineering, crashed UFOs, alien bodies, even communication, right? And interaction. Haim Eshed's claims, which were, pulled out from quotes from his book and then distributed in the media. And here's some of them, okay, that I've pulled out here. We might as well read it. We might as well read it together here. This is from Haim Eshed. Quote, "The UFOs ask not to advertise they are here. Humanity is not ready yet. They are waiting for us to develop and reach a stage where we will understand in general what space and spacecraft are. There is an agreement between the US government and extraterrestrials to do experiments with us here. There is a group of partners. All of them are coordinated at a level that is still forbidden to publish. The Galactic Federation. It exists. I wrote about it even though it was seen as a conspiracy theory. But former senior generals are also saying to publish. But the aliens in the Federation are saying, wait, don't publish yet because you're still fighting each other. You'll destroy yourselves. They want to tell humanity, calm down. They are also researching and trying to understand the whole fabric of the universe. Yes, we have anti-gravity and other things. There is an underground base on Mars, and there are aliens there as well as American astronauts. There is an obsessive system of silence under the guidance of the aliens. Most countries are isolated from it. So obviously there is a lot to unpack in that statement, and probably won't go at length at it here. Probably worth doing a separate video on a deep dive into Haim Eshed's claims. But I think what's important for us to realize in how it relates to Karl Nell's recent public statements is that this is the whole kit and caboodle here in terms of the UFO and alien conspiracy. And here, once again, we have Karl Nell. All right, we went over his credentials earlier in the program here, coming out and dropping the name of Haim Eshed, right? Vouching for Haim Eshed, who, to review here, is saying there is a galactic federation working with elements of the US and humanity, but that don't want to reveal their existence, that we have anti-gravity, and then boom, if that wasn't enough, we have an underground base on Mars with aliens and American astronauts working together. Okay, so peel that back for just a moment. Karl Nell, from what I'm told, and based on his resume, is an extremely intelligent person. And like it was said in his 2022 evaluation by the Department of Defense, he has the highest moral compass. So I would highly, highly doubt that he would just freely throw Haim Eshed's name out there, knowing what Haim Eshed has published. And so we're talking about humans out in space in underground bases on Mars with other and non-human beings. All right, and this is pretty wild, and I do think it's a good sign. And I think what we could probably close out on here on this analysis on the whole Karl Nell story is that this is a good sign. Why do I think that? Because someone like Karl Nell, who is really like the only high-level person that is attaching themselves to David Grusch. I mean, yes, you do have Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who's doing the same thing, who of course has backed up Karl Nell. So it appears we're getting the so-called white hats, and what we mean by that is, the people that are working from the inside to actually bring truth out. I mean, that's what we hope they're doing. I do have to say, Tim Gallaudet does seem like a very honest person, but again, how do we know? How can we really know? We're just watching people on screens talk. But again, he has a highly, highly reputable background, and he's very close with Ryan Graves, of course, and all of that. So here you have Tim Gallaudet, you have Karl Nell now, and Gallaudet is the other one who keeps dropping the non-human intelligent beings are 100% real kind of bombshell out there. So it's good because, like I've said before, I think that if they really wanted to, whatever that is, they could roll this out and say, hey guys, yeah, we have recovered crafts, but we have no idea how they work, and we have to keep keeping it a secret, and we're sorry we kept it a secret for 80 years. Yes, there's been some biologics, but we have to keep it highly, highly classified, and we don't understand it, and so it is what it is. Nothing to see here, nothing more to see here. When meanwhile, when you get into the full depth of the UFO field, you see that there is a pattern of claims of there being more to it, such as the technology was figured out, anti-gravity was mastered, there are spaceships were put out in space, and who knows what these secret powerful cabals who operate in apparently a masterful degree of secrecy to keep the masses of humanity completely ignorant of this. But here you have Karl Nell coming out a few days ago and dropping Haim Eshed's name. And Haim Eshed, once again, not to be repetitive, but to reiterate, is saying there's an underground base on Mars with humans and aliens working together. He's saying we have anti-gravity craft. He's saying there's a galactic federation um, for our galaxy and so forth. So, wow, you know, it's either one of two things. It's either Karl Nell is just secretly like a UFO believer and is using his position to like promote UFO stories that haven't been verified, or Karl Nell really knows. And that kind of leads me to where my mind goes is like, what does he really know? Has he seen literally craft? Has he met beings? Is he working as a kind of ambassador potentially with non-human intelligence? And is Tim Gallaudet? Have they volunteered or been chosen to slowly kind of be these type of people? I don't know. But it's a good sign. It really is a good sign because whatever does end up coming out, they're going to have to explain Karl Nell going up there and saying, I am Eshed is, on point. Paul Hellyer's on point. They're going to have to explain that and walk that back because Nell has already thrown it out there. I mean, and Grusch did in his claims as well. So yeah, we've talked about this. What does this tell us about signs of the disclosure to come? And yes, we've talked about what it means to drop these names. So that's what I think are really the key parts about thinking about Karl Nell and what he just said, what he just revealed. So yeah, it's definitely significant. And we'll see how things continue to develop. I think the key part, I will say on the side of caution, and actually, we have a couple minutes here. Let's actually look over and to see if there's anything that we left out because I did type out what he was saying in the new interview. Um, yeah, it is worth actually looking at. This is what he said in the new interview the other day. I was starting to listen to it, and I think I listened to the whole thing and pulled out the quotes. But he said, non-human intelligence exists. It has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. That means it's still going on now. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that. And of course, the famous, how confident are you that is true? There's zero doubt. And, he goes on to kind of makes his ideological points where he says the government exists for and by the people. And so the nature of reality is not fundamentally government information. The people have a right to know the world in which we live. And the pursuit of happiness requires that knowledge. So I do agree. I do agree with Karl. And it is an issue of fundamental rights here. People will argue national security and all that, but I do agree that it does go deeper than that. And so super interesting. And on the cautious side, I will just end by saying, I hope that Karl Nell really does have conclusive evidence that he's seen that's giving him the confidence to go out there and say these things. I hope he's not just basing what he thinks on Haim Eshed or Paul Hellyer, because as much as I love those guys and I think they're super important to this whole subject and what they came out and said, technically Paul Hellyer really, it seems like his best evidence was one Air Force general telling him that there have been face-to-face meetings with aliens and U.S. officials. And even though that's great, we don't know who this Air Force general was, and if he was just making it up, feeding Paul Hellyer disinformation, who knows? And then Haim Eshed is still a mystery. How did he know that? In his book, or in the interview about his book, which you can dig up online, it's actually online in Hebrew, the interview about his book a few years ago, and there's a lot more information in there. That's where I got a lot of those quotes I put together there we went over. Haim Eshed says in the interview, I can't prove this to you, but I know, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know what that means. Does that mean that he can't share the evidence because it's so top secret and he wouldn't be able to make it available? And that's a safe assumption. Or is he just saying that like he believes it? I don't know. And I just hope Karl Nell isn't gaining his confidence just from like Haim Eshed and Paul Hellyer, because we don't know that they had conclusive evidence. They technically, to be fair, they may just been believers based on the body of evidence that's already out there in the literature. So we do need to be careful, I think. But I am hoping for the best. I am hoping that this will be the case. And at the very least, we have Karl Nell going out there for the home run and getting behind claims that it's much more than just unknown things in the sky and maybe some bodies and some crafts and gadgets that have been recovered. We're talking about galactic federations, underground bases on Mars, etc. And we deserve it. I think to have a better world in the long run, we got to get it all out there. And I think we can handle it, especially if we have someone like Karl Nell who's calling for a very thoughtful, slow, gradual disclosure plan over a period of years that can get us to full disclosure, but maybe not just drop it all at once. And part of what he's arguing is that if we don't have that plan, then it could just all come out at once, or even from another country, and then we would have, the buzzword that has been going around, catastrophic disclosure. So I think that it's quite logical what he is saying. And at the very least, once again, it's a good sign that he's going behind what we could say are not conservative claims. He could easily come out there and just say, like, yes, there's unidentified craft and we must get better sensors and figure it out, like some of the really conservative officials say when they're asked about this. He's going out there, he's got out there with the big stick. Haim Eshed and Paul Hellyer. So anyway, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.